Okay, everyone, so we left off actually looking at our LibreOffice document, which notably opened our Excel file, right? That's kind of the point of LibreOffice and its companion OpenOffice. LibreOffice is a little bit nicer, although they're both free, so feel free to use what you like. But this does actually provide a really good opportunity for us to talk about one of the main features, one of the things that we want to look at with when we're dealing with data formats, and this applies both to thinking about our own data access and also data publishing. So XLS is a Microsoft Excel format. You may have noticed in this list that there's both XLS and XLSX. Both of these are Microsoft Excel formats and kind of point to one of the issues with dealing with proprietary software like Microsoft Excel, which is that the software changes over time. The file format doesn't, the extension doesn't always change, but what it does do is mean that you can end up with versions of Excel files that are not forward or backward compatible, meaning that they cannot be opened with an older or newer version of the software. So you're kind of tied to this license, and it's something to be considerate of, because anytime that you're publishing data, that you are requesting data, that you're sharing data, you run the risk of compatibility errors if you use a proprietary format. There are times when using a proprietary format like Excel makes sense. It does have certain affordances that things like a CSV file, which we'll look at in a moment, don't have. It doesn't have a lot of advantages over something like LibreOffice, which is sort of designed to be a robust alternative to Excel. But so it's something to keep in mind. The other thing that, besides being proprietary, is if we actually look at the file size on this. Let's take a look at, here we are. So I'm just looking at the data size. So this is, obviously this is a tiny file, right? We have about, a dozen or so, a few dozen lines. So it's only a 20 kilobyte file, right? Which is not a lot. And for the most part, a lot of the data that you deal with is not going to be, of huge size. We tend to use, in this practice, we tend to use more on the small to maybe medium-sized data in the world of big data, which is absolutely fine. Bigger isn't necessarily better. In fact, very often there's some really compelling work on the value of small data. But that doesn't mean that we don't want to minimize where we can, and again, sort of have accessibility options there. So the next format that we're going to look at is CSV. CSV, you should know from your reading, stands for comma-separated value. And as it describes in there, comma-separated value is actually a generic term that basically means what we would call a delimited file. In other words, it is, at its heart, it is a text file. You do not need any special software to open it. You don't, for example, need Microsoft Excel. You don't even need LibreOffice. And we're going to illustrate that right now by downloading our file as a CSV. So again, it's going to sort of come in naming it, the same, with a similar convention. And if I go in here, so first of all, I see right away on this file size issue, right? My CSV is less than half the size of the Excel document, which again, when we're dealing with 20 kilobytes, not a big deal, but as you start to get up into the hundreds of kilobytes or certainly megabytes of data, you want to be mindful of minimizing the footprint to what's absolutely necessary. So one thing I want to illustrate here is that while if I double click on this, very often a sort of default, here we go, this is wanting to open it in Office. I would like to not do that, please. Okay, I want to get out of here. See, already Excel is causing problems. I'm going to force quit that. Yep. Yes, I would like to force quit. So you can see that default, which was not what I was hoping for, I can right-click this. I can go ahead and open this in LibreOffice. And now here's an interesting screen. So this is asking us a whole bunch of questions about our data. One of the things you'll see is things about delimiters, but I want to skip all this for now and just re-emphasize this point that I made, that a CSV file, a comma-separated value file, is a text file. And what that means is that I can open it with a simple text editor. And so I'm actually going to do exactly that. I'm going to choose text edit from my applications here. And now what I can see here is the layout of my file. So with a little bit of inspection, I can compare it to whatever file format I like. But you see here I have health code article number, comma, health code description, comma, URL, which corresponds to the columns of my data. And then on each new line, I see a new row of data. So this is what it means for this to be a comma separated value. It basically means that every column of data is delimited by a comma, except for the last one. That's an useful thing to note, right? I often say this is like writing a list in an English sentence. We put commas between items of a list, but we do not put a comma at the end. And we'll see this reflected in other data formats as well. But this, just taking a quick look at this as a CSV is a good way for us to kind of understand some of the important features of the data set, which come up when we want to open it with another program. So I'm going to go back, having seen this now, I'm going to go back to LibreOffice, wherever LibreOffice went. There it is. And I'm going to, or actually I'm going to do an open with. There's obviously a few different ways that we can do this. So here I am back at my CSV, and I'm going to say, let's open this with LibreOffice. Okay, so back to this now. This can kind of look like an intimidating interface. It looks like a lot of questions are being asked and assumptions are being made. So let's just break this down, because this is a very common type of sort of first dialogue window that you're going to encounter when you're using spreadsheet programs, when you're using any kind of data delimiting and importation program. The questions are basically going to be the same, and it's good to get familiar with them so you can kind of map your way through new interfaces. So the first thing it's asking about the import is the character set. Unicode UTF-8. This is a pretty standard default character set. Generally, you can leave this part alone. Obviously, we're pretty comfortable that the language we're working in here is English, although obviously it's giving us a whole variety of options. From row 1, so one of the things that it's giving us the option to do here that we might use, for example, if we were trying to import a very large data set, we might only want to import, the last, from rows 100 to 200 or something like that. We can choose not to start at the first row. Separator options. So this is where our sort of delimiter issue comes in. So you see that it has chosen in here, it has chosen by default this radio button separated by, delimited by, or equivalent statements here. I'm just going to make one comment about fixed width. Fixed width is not very common anymore. It was very common for a long time because essentially before computers got smarter, rather than being able to recognize something like a comma, a tab, a semicolon, or a space as the demarcator between columns of information that might have different lengths, essentially what databases would do is they would simply set aside a certain amount of space for each column, and then that column's data had to occupy exactly that amount of space so that it would know essentially where to draw the line, kind of like pulling a ruler across a page. And what that meant was there was often a lot of extra white space in these things. They became much more, it was extremely cumbersome to deal with, and again, you are not likely to encounter it unless you're dealing with a database that is relatively antiquated, which depending on your work you might. So you can see here that they've kind of just gone whole hog here. So let's try to separate it by everything, right? Maybe it's a tab, maybe it's a comma, maybe it's a semicolon, maybe it's a space. What I have here that's nice is I have a little preview window. So it is, it's kind of saying, okay, this is what I think is gonna, this is what the data is gonna look like, if you choose, based on the selections that you have here. So for example, if I choose space, if you see how that's changed, right? And of course, why does that happen? Well, because I have some text in here that, has spaces in it. And of course, I don't really want to break up on that. They are complete phrases that I want to keep together. But sometimes, I might have a file that's still limited by a space. In this case, having inspected this already in my text edit program, I know that my delimiter is a comma. The other thing I'll point out here is what's called the text delimiter. Now, the text delimiter, as we just noted, sometimes a space is used as a delimiter. Well, that can be problematic because, of course, sometimes we have data that has spaces in it, and those spaces are part of sentences that we don't want broken into separate columns. Sometimes too, while using commas, sentences can also have commas in them, and we don't necessarily want to break up those sentences on those commas either. Now, how's a poor program to tell what should be broken on and what shouldn't be? Well, one thing that you can do is you can wrap text in either single or double quotes, very often it's double quotes, and say, yes, this is a comma-separated value file, but anything that is in quotation marks treat as a block and do not break on any commas in that. Now, we don't have that issue. Actually, we do have that issue here, don't we? It'll be interesting to see, for example, reportable diseases, comma, conditions. It'll be interesting to see how that processes. So we're going to go ahead and say OK here. And yeah, as a matter of fact, we see that there does seem to be a bit of a, no, where's reportable diseases? So it seems actually that that there probably is, and this is often the case. Let's come back to our health code CSV. Yes, so actually, again, if we look in our, and I'm going to zoom in for you guys here, I think. I can never remember how to do this right away. If you look at the CSV file here, you will see that there are double quotes around there. So you see that our text delimiter was in fact being used, even though it might not have stuck out to us right at the beginning. So now we've seen how we can get between, a comma-separated value file, an Excel file, and get them sort of imported into different programs. It's also important to realize that I can save, quote-unquote, save down, sometimes the term we use when we're using less complicated formats. I can take, for example, my original Excel file opened in LibreOffice, and I can pretty much always save it as a different file format. So you see there's all this really specific junk in here, but I can go ahead and just say, you know what, just save it as CSV. There are other options, open document templates, XML files. We'll talk about that in a second. But so if I get something as an Excel file, I also have the option to essentially to modify it so again, and when I export to a CSV, it's going to ask me many of the same questions. Some people like to have a pipe as a delimiter because pipes are not actually used in English and therefore don't run into the same delimiting conflicts that another file format might. But I can go ahead and do this, and we'll see that I end up with a CSV very similar to the one that I had. So I'll go back to text edit here. And there we go. Very nicely preserved. Okay, so from here we're going to move on to some additional file formats, and the distinction between the ones we've been looking at so far and the ones that we are going to look at next is that the reason why we got into these file formats in the first place was essentially the desire to quote-unquote save a copy of our data, which HTML is not very good at doing other than, to save a link to it, but what if the link disappears, right? So we want to save a copy of it. So CSV, TXT, Excel, all of these formats are really good for saving a copy of our own on our local hard drive, but they're not necessarily great for sort of serving data over the web. And yes, HTML is good for that, but in principle, what we want to do when we're working with web data is we want to be able to extract, we want to basically be able to extract our data from its presentation format. And so in doing that, there are two primary formats for this. One is XML, and the other is JSON. And so we're going to look at XML and JSON next, how they relate, how they're different, why they're used and what they're used for, and how we can actually move from one to the other. So I will see you again in just a moment.